When I was maybe 14, I lived in a rural area of BC interior. As young teens do, I got bored easily in my small town. To alleviate my boredom, my friends and I would routinely explore the surrounding areas and go on day-long hikes. There are two instances that I can remember being very creepy during our expeditions. The first was in the summer. My two friends and I decided to do a hike across several kilometers. We of course prepared for this adequately, as any group of 14-year-olds would. We had water and a bag of jerky between the three of us. We all got really hungry after getting through the bag of jerky, so we had to decide what was the best way to go. We figured out that if we cut through some back roads and farmland, we could get to the highway faster and thus to food. After about an hour of hungry hiking, we come upon a little village that was all gated up and surrounded by brambles. This itself wasn't too creepy. What was creepy was the fact that just inside the gate was a mountain of cattle skeletons and corpses. Now there seriously had to have been at least 3 piles of them. As kids, we were sufficiently spooked. As an adult, I'm still not quite sure why this was there. Maybe it was a quarantine for a disease. I don't know. Either way, it's creepy as hell to think about. The second time was with the same friends, but we were a few years older. On this adventure, we decided to walk to the railroad tracks and gather old railroad spikes to collect them for the scrapper. After a few hours of grueling hiking and carrying increasingly heavy loads, we come upon this home. It was very secluded, but from the outside, it didn't look abandoned. Curiosity took over. We dropped our bags and went exploring. We initially just wanted some water, but found the front door was wide open. Outside, there was lots of construction machinery, so we thought maybe they were doing some fishing work. We called out, but received no reply. Then, in an act of recklessness, we decided effectively to break and enter. This place turned out to be an absolute dump. It looked like an old crack house. Old garbage and food everywhere. We assumed nobody lived there after all. So what do? We decided to snoop around. As we're poking around on the ground floor, we heard what sounded like footsteps on the second floor. We called out, again no answer. My one brave friend decided that he was going to go up and check. As he got up there, he called out, nothing. So he starts up the stairs even further. Now, I'm not even joking. Literally the second that his foot hit the tread, a music box went off. Alright, kind of creepy, but then we heard a kid's giggle from directly above us. That was on the floor that didn't have any stairs. Obviously we noped the hell out of there. We even forgot our backpacks. I was living in a dirt floor cabin for about 6 months. I would pack a lunch and hike out half a day in random directions. So one day, I found an abandoned hotel with an attic full of bats. The kitchen was old, but full of taxidermy. Not abandoned old taxidermy, current taxidermy, and various states of fish. Then, there was a closet with stacks of dead birds in it, tools, woodwork tools, glass for the displays, etc. I noped out of there in a hurry. I took my brother there later because he didn't believe me. We didn't end up investigating any further because, to be honest, we were worried about what we might find. On a 2-week solo backpacking trip, I spent 2 days in seclusion between ranger station check-ins. On the first day of seclusion, I felt like I was being stalked. As I lay in my tent at night, I could hear what sounded like footsteps around my camping site, but never too close. In the morning, I would check all around but find no evidence of footprints or any wildlife around me. I broke down the camp and took off trying to put everything behind me. I was getting rather worried now. The second night was the same thing. I grew so paranoid that when I would hike during the day, I would go over rocks, walk through streams, anything to try and break my trail. I would even go around a blind turn and just sit there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, just making sure that nobody else was coming up behind me. At night, I couldn't sleep for more than 10 minutes before being woken up. Finally, I got to the ranger station check-in and told them what I'd been experiencing. I went and set up camp as close to the station as I possibly could. Later, the rangers offered me to sleep on their couch for comfort so I could actually sleep. I accepted and stayed indoors that night. So I walked over to my camp in the morning and it had been destroyed. My tent was cut on the inside, sleeping bag ripped apart. The rangers come and reported it. I was so scared by this that I actually ended up getting one of the rangers to give me a ride back to base and went straight home after. When I worked as a fire lookout, we had 6 lookout stations, but we're now down to 2. It depends on how many fire recons there are nowadays, whether they use them or not. So anyway, being at such a high elevation, you get radio signals from miles and miles away. I was stationed up in Oregon, but I could still hear radio stations from Texas and Mexico, although they were really quiet and cut out. I would also hear the weirdest CV radio chatter as well, lonely truckers, ham nuts, and just some weird stuff. So one time I got a call from somebody looking for the kid in the lookout tower. It wasn't a very strong signal, so they weren't super close, but they asked a lot of questions about terrain and if they could drive up to the tower. I told them sure, come on up. Another recon then asked me who I was talking to, because they could only hear my end of the convo. I told them I was probably getting visitors. A few hours later, this beat up truck come up the road and stopped under my tower. This really dirty looking guy had come out, looked up at me, studied it for a bit, waved and yelled, "Can you come down?" I didn't know there was that many stairs. I yelled back that I was on duty and couldn't leave it. He kind of shrugged and looked around for a bit and said goodbye and drove back down the hill. A week later, as I drove off into town, I passed the same truck about 3 miles down from the tower, facing uphill, like he was on his way back up. I didn't see the guy anywhere and assumed he was camping off the trail. When I came back up in 2 days, it was still there. A fire truck come about a week later, and I had to investigate as the truck had been there for so long and was obviously abandoned. Turns out, the dude just disappeared. Nobody really looked for him either. I'm pretty sure I was the last person to see him alive. I speculate he parked on and went into the woods and had a heart attack or stroke. He wasn't keen on climbing the 10 flights of stairs and obviously wasn't in the best of shape. I assumed I spent the entire rest of the summer within a short distance of his body, but maybe he did abandon his truck and got a ride home from a friend. The creepy part is, I never found out. I work as a park operator in British Columbia. I work the night shift as their security and collections guy. So one night, it was fairly overcast and super dark. I was parked at the bottom of the road leading down to the campground. I had the windows rolled down and was playing around on my phone as the shift was almost over. Suddenly, out of my passenger side window, I could hear the sound of crunching footsteps moving around me. There wasn't anything that alarmed me though, as we generally have bears in the area and other wildlife. I just kind of listened as whatever it was walked around, kinda lightly on the edge. Then, it sounded to pick up the pace, like it was running directly at my truck. It was pitch black and I've got my hands up, ready for something to try and jump through the window at me out of complete darkness. But just before I was sure I was about to be attacked, it suddenly goes perfectly silent. I said no thanks, started up the truck, and zoomed up in the cabin to get away from whatever was going on there. So at this point, I'm already on edge to the max. I'm just thinking, lock the gate, go home. Yep, lock the gate, go home. Unfortunately, prior to me leaving in my personal vehicle, I have to put the parks truck key away in the shop inside this fenced off compound which is just so inconveniently unlit. So I whip out my cell phone, turn on the crappy LED and start making my way over to the shed. I'm trying my hardest not to freak myself out, but as I'm walking towards the gate, I hear this horridly loud screech sound. I live in rural Ohio. One of my friends owns a nice farm and farmhouse out in the sticks where the buses don't run and there's no service. He doesn't actually live there. His family owns a house for shiggles. They're millionaires. We've never ran there, and it seems like a pretty scenic wood place, so I decided to give it a shot. He and I both run cross country, so we're both in pretty good shape. We get to his barn and we plan on running 8 miles near a road and then through the woods. We have GPS watches so we can make sure our path is correct, and we either turn back at 4 miles or do a big loop if we so desire. After about 2 miles of running on the road, we took a random gravel road through the woods, and there was a hiking path through it, so we decided to take this. We live in the country, so this really isn't a big deal. We've done this sort of thing before. I gotten lost in the woods in runs a few times throughout high school, but never actually done it myself this far away from home. I don't run with my glasses on, and I'm blind as a bat. I'm making good pace when all of a sudden I smack into my friend. I look up and he's just standing there. I focus on what he's looking at, and there's this bear trap hanging from a branch in front of us. Looking around, there's more, all blowing in the breeze. We also see something pressed up against a tree that looks like a man. My friend pushed me and told me to run. We didn't say a word until we got back to the main road because how fast we ran. Turns out, my friend saw what looked like a bloody scarecrow up against a tree. He then saw bear traps on the ground around it. I was on a small sailing boat in the Pacific, sailing south from Panama to Ecuador in the middle of the night. 2 people on the deck, the helmsman and me. Theoretically on lookout, but really just making sure the helmsman was awake. It's after midnight and we're sailing away from major shipping lanes. We're somewhere west of Colombia and haven't seen land or another vessel in at least a day. I then look up to see a light off the port bow. It's far off and distant and under the sail, therefore it's hard to keep track of. It isn't moving, it seems to flicker and dim gradually, but I become aware that it's a little brighter bit by bit. I then realise it's a boat, coming straight at us. By this time I hear the engine and yell to the helmsman, hard a port. So we quickly made a left turn and the oncoming boat passes on the starboard bow. It's less than 10 meters away. It's a big RIB with a massive engine. It's still going full throttle at this point, and there's enough light from the moon and our running lights to see that there's only one person on board. They're slumped upright, and they're over the steering column, and there's a load of fishing equipment in the back. Then, it's gone into the night. Now this happened 10 years ago. To this day, I still have no idea what that fisherman was doing, whether he was dead or alive, if he'd fallen asleep at the wheel or suffered a heart attack. I don't know if he powered on until the boat ran out of fuel, never to be seen again, or woke up 5 minutes later and just went back. I don't know what he was doing that far from the other boats. We later saw some other lights on the horizon and guessed that they were a fishing fleet, or whether he aimed at us deliberately, or maybe it wasn't him doing this. I still wonder what happened to that tiny boat out in the empty sea. The man who told me about his terrifying experience in Colorado is one of the most distant relatives that everybody has. They're your third cousin, twice removed or something to that effect. I'm not positive how exactly we're related, but he's an incredible guy. I'll call him Greg. Greg is a decorated green beret with a silver star to his name that he earned by capturing the leader of an Afghan sniper without even taking any casualties in the process. Despite his status as this badass and the fact he's 6'3" and 200 pounds, he's a giant teddy bear. Greg is extremely humble, a really kind person. I have a lot of experience in the outdoors, having lived in Colorado for most of my life. And Greg and I have an extended conversation about our adventures in the woods at our grandmother's house for Thanksgiving. We're sitting on the couch wearing this tracky holiday sweater when the conversation turned to hunting. Greg mentioned offhand that he used to be an avid hunter, but had an experience that turned him off it for life. He said he doesn't even like guns anymore, This was something that I found truly surprising, seeing as he used to be a military man. I pushed him to tell me what happened, and he seemed uncomfortable with this. He finally did though. I'm going to switch to first person now, and write exactly what he told me. It was during late October, which means elk season up in the Indian Peaks wilderness. And I went up there to bag a few elk and just relax for a few days by myself. I parked near a trailhead about 8 miles from where I wound up camping, and was looking forward to a nice weekend in the woods with some peace and quiet after packing all my gear and getting ready. The first morning, I was in my deer blind about 20 feet up in a tree with a cup of coffee and my rifle, and the sun had just come up about an hour ago. About 50 yards away from my tree, the tree line ended and opened into this big meadow where a lot of elk tended to roll through. Now, I could scope through my rifle and see pretty well through the trees, and see most of this big grassy area. Maybe a couple of hours passed, which really isn't boring that deep in the woods. I just drank my coffee from my thermos, and listened to all the life around me, feeling the woods getting ready for winter. I couldn't believe my luck when I glanced over at the meadow and saw a large group of elk that had started grazing in the meadow. The silent animals plodded along, munching on grass, completely oblivious to me watching. Among the group was one of the most beautiful elk that I had ever seen. It was called a monarch, which means it has 8 points each on its antlers, something very rare. I quietly clicked the safety off my rifle and sighted in. When you're hunting an animal like this, you have to put the bullet right where the skull is, and right where this meets the spine. That's in order to sever the spinal column and kill it instantly and painlessly. You have to focus on this zone, and the focus you need to do this is incredible. Now I swear I could feel the firing pin punch forward and the bullet leave the barrel as I pulled the trigger. This beautiful elk then went silently down, all the others scattered for the tree line. I was ecstatic though. I did such a good shot. I climbed down out of the blind and set off for the meadow. I left my rifle behind me as I made my way towards the meadow. This is something that I really come to regret. And I only had my small knife on me to cut the animal and then drag it back to camp. As I was making my short way between the blind and the meadow, I noticed that the woods around me were completely silent. Some of this is normal, especially after you just fired a gun in the woods, but for it to drag out this long was unsettling. I thought nothing of it and continued the short walk through the dense pines. As I was about to clear the trees and step into the meadow, I noticed something odd. I could see the elk's body lying in the tall grass of the trees. There was something else there. The area was what looked to be another elk. This thing had antlers and all. It was on the opposite side of the dead elk from where I was coming from. Now I had to walk through that tree line to reach it, and whatever this thing was, it was almost looking as though it were gently nuzzling on the other elk's dead body. That was weird. To see an elk treat another dead elk like this. They're usually scattered. I continued walking towards it. I started making some sounds and trying to be loud in order to get rid of this thing in front of me. Then, it snapped its head up and looked at me. Over the body of its fallen friend, this strange new elk eyed me with an unfamiliar glare. I say glare, it didn't feel like an animal looking at me anymore. Its glassy black eyes gave me the same caught red-handed feeling you get when your parents punish you. I felt suddenly uncomfortable and out of place in the woods that I loved just so much, and somehow hated the guilt. I no longer wanted the elk. I stopped dead in my tracks and watched this animal as it eyed me angrily. What it did next gives me nightmares. It wasn't an elk, it stood up. Now the thing that stood before me must have been lying on its stomach as it put its arms down and pushed up, putting its legs under. It reared back glaring at me, almost evil, with glassy eyes. My breath caught in my throat. Most of its body was at least somewhat human, though much of it was terribly long, and it just didn't seem normal. It appeared to be about 10 feet tall, not including the antlers atop of its head. It was bald everywhere but the back up, and it looked pale and bony in a way. Its legs, the knees bent backwards, like the back of an elk. This horrible, skinny, naked, unnatural thing just stood there glaring at me. The woods were still silent. It might have been 10 seconds, might have been 10 minutes. God, it could have been hours. I felt terrible though. It really was a harrowing feeling. I took a step back. My boots felt like 10 pounds, my body felt numb, and the noise of my footsteps were ear-splitting. I took one more look and turned and ran. I ran as fast as I possibly could. I've never ran so fast in my life. I passed under my blind, with my $4,000 rifle sitting in it, without even slowing down. I then ran all the way back, which must have easily been at least a mile, before I even stopped to take a breath. It took me another minute to dare to look behind me. I was alone, but the woods around me was still silent. Now, I wanted more than anything to pack up and go home, but I knew I would not likely make it back to the car before nightfall. I didn't want to be out there at night. I cooked an MRE in my tent and stayed in there for the rest of the night. When night fell, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop myself from startling at every single little sound. I kept thinking about possible rational explanations for what I saw. Maybe there's a crazy guy out there that found an elk head and's wearing it to scare people. Maybe I'm hallucinating. I couldn't come up with anything. It was a really horrible feeling, and I hated being so far away from home. Nothing explained what I saw. Why was it so tall? Maybe it's a skinwalker. As soon as the sun come up, I ran back to the blind and took it down, then ran back to camp with my rifle and packed up everything and hiked out. I'm sure I was hallucinating though, right? I've never fired a gun in the woods since. I don't ever intend to again. I'm not a spiritual person, but if I wasn't hallucinating, then something in the forest was telling me to leave it alone. I don't know what it is. I can take a hint, but I'll never know exactly what that creature was, what I saw, but I know that I'm never going out hunting again. God, even thinking of this story terrifies me. I just pray that it was all hallucination and it wasn't real. So I live just outside of a town nestled at the bottom of the mountains in Australia. It's not too secluded since I live with my family, and you'll generally come across somebody's property every 500 meters or so. But sometimes you'll get a stretch where you don't see a house for miles. So one night, my mum and I are coming home pretty late at night and we're just talking and listening to the radio. We come round the corner and we both saw this creature. To this day, I still don't know what it was, but it had the body the size of a medium dog, mangy looking black fur, almost an impossibly abnormally large head, big green eyes. That's the first thing I noticed about it, but most weirdly was an almost possibly long neck, and it was really thin. Like it shouldn't have been able to support the head. My mother and I started cursing like crazy and made an insane U-turn, trying to get around as far as possible from it. Within 10 seconds of looking back though, there was no trace of it. Normally I'd brush this off as probably a wild dog, but it was nothing like a dog. The scary part is that my family and I have seen that maybe 2 to 3 times now, almost exclusively at night. However, my SO's father said that he'd seen it twice also, once at day and once at night, and I get the feeling that we're not the only people that have ever seen it. Now I don't live in Tasmania, so it's impossible to be a Tasmanian devil, but I have no idea what the hell this thing is. My dad's a logger, specifically one who operates on a tree saw, which is basically a giant machine that's capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to an exact length. This means that he spends a lot of time alone deep in the forest. The way my dad's cutting log crew operates is that he would be told where he's supposed to cut down trees, and he would then go and do that and be paid based on the amount of trees he could cut and how they liked them. So my dad used to work about 16 to 20 hours a day constantly. He did such long hours to try and get done as quickly as possible, and then the rest of the crew would come and clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He used to work around half of the time alone, and the rest with another tree saw operator named Brandy. Now, they would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. Sorry for all of the backstory, now to the main part. My dad and Randy were put on a new job site and were about 10 days in, and everything was going as planned. But they were constantly hearing weird chitter chatter over the radio that was such poor quality that no words could be heard, just the weird sounds. They kept changing it, but they constantly heard it. As they progressed through the job and went further up into the mountains, the words from the radio slowly become more audible. Both of them agreed that based on the small parts of the conversation they could hear, something was wrong. They also started finding weird containers all over the place and signs that people had been there. People should not have been there. This was a 2.5-hour drive up the mountains. They had to spend 3 weeks clearing out the roads so their trucks and equipment could operate. They then come to the realization that they're in a very secluded area with people who shouldn't be there, and the worst part is that they aren't scheduled to leave for about another week. Now one day, Randy comes across a tent and calls my dad over. They investigate the tent to find one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. Now the bags were full of what appeared to be a rape kit, rope, duct tape, etc., and lots of illegal photographs. Within the tent, they also found lots of canned goods, which means that people have been there recently, as there was also no mold in any of the food around them. The best case scenario to this situation is that it's one really messed up person. Randy instantly wants to get the hell out of there, but my dad, being the hardest person I know, decided that they have to finish the job, then get out of there. They decide that they're not going to talk over the radios except in case of emergencies, in case they hear anything. They're now in close enough proximity to whoever's talking to each other to hear a conversation, and it's two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. Nothing abnormal, except for the fact that these guys don't belong here, and it was undoubtedly their tent. At the end of the workday, my dad hears them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hops on the radio and attempts to communicate with them about what the hell they're doing. I believe he said, "Who are you? Why are you here?" After this, the conversation between the two men abruptly ends and they never pick up again. Later that night, Randy wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun and somebody's inside. My dad does as he's told, and the first thing he hears when he wakes up is quiet snuffling and footsteps outside. My dad fumbles for his gun but realizes that he doesn't even have it loaded, and has little clue to where his rounds are. Randy has nothing except a cell phone and is calling for the police. They hear a jiggle on the doorknob and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground where you had to jump in, and there's no ladder or footstool. It just stays open. Neither my dad nor Randy move. They hear scratching right outside of the door. After about 4 minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer hear it and nods at Randy. He gets up and quietly walks towards the camper door, and the second he reaches it, he's met with the most intense pain across his right eye, all the way to his left cheek. He's been cut and falls out of the camper and hits the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him. He's then soon getting kicked in the head by a man behind him. Randy leaps out of the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad, and my dad gets up and realizes that the second man without the knife is running away, and the man with the knife is scrambling away from Randy and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Randy get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad for wounds and later report it to the police. They both quit their jobs about 2 weeks after. The rest of the crew actually had to go back up there and finish the login. One of them was found gagged, bound, and murdered and thrown into a ditch. Nobody's ever been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured so it looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. He actually suffers PTSD as a result of these events now. I have 2 stories for you. Both take place in the Rocky Mountain region. We don't like to camp in campgrounds because we're antisocial, and none of us care to share a camping ground with strangers screaming kids. So when we go camping, we do some mild off-roading and camping clearings away from other people. So just after high school, Me and my friends decided to celebrate by going on a camping trip. We ended up leaving way later than we planned. It was dark by the time we got up into the mountains. The camping spot was about an hour or so away from home. We didn't want to turn round, so we decided just to mark due and set up. I work as a park operator in British Columbia. I work the night shift as their security and collections guy. So one night, it was fairly overcast and super dark. I was parked at the bottom of the road leading down to the campground. I had the windows rolled down and was playing around on my phone as the shift was almost over. Suddenly, out of my passenger side window, I could hear the sound of crunching footsteps moving around me. There wasn't anything that alarmed me though, as we generally have bears in the area and other wildlife. I just kind of listened as whatever it was walked around, kinda lightly on the edge. Then, it sounded to pick up the pace, like it was running directly at my truck. It was pitch black and I've got my hands up, ready for something to try and jump through the window at me out of complete darkness. But just before I was sure I was about to be attacked, it suddenly goes perfectly silent. I said no thanks, started up the truck, and zoomed up in the cabin to get away from whatever was going on there. So at this point, I'm already on edge to the max. I'm just thinking, lock the gate, go home. Yep, lock the gate, go home. Unfortunately, prior to me leaving in my personal vehicle, I have to put the parks truck key away in the shop inside this fenced off compound which is just so inconveniently unlit. So I whip out my cell phone, turn on the crappy LED and start making my way over to the shed. I'm trying my hardest not to freak myself out, but as I'm walking towards the gate, I hear this horridly loud screech sound, like an alarm's been turned on. At this point, my whole body went into fight or flight. I'm terrified. The sound persisted, and I recognised that it was a sound that golf carts make when they're left in reverse. But generally, you'd know if you left that on because you'd hear the sound when you parked it. So now in my mind I'm thinking, alright, what the hell is going on? Who the hell turned that on? So I sneak over there and slowly turn towards a horrid sound with my cell phone light, really expecting to see an axe murderer. I ran up pretty quickly and pulled the reverse lever off while expecting it to be somebody waiting for me, but nothing. I literally tossed the park keys into the shed and ran for my truck. As I got into my truck, I quickly checked to make sure nobody was waiting in the seat for me. As I started driving, some more lights went out. I'd driven out of there faster than I've ever drove in my entire life before.